This is Daniel Fagelli. You're tuned into The Trajectory, and this is our third episode in the AGI Governance series. Our guest this week is Stephen Ibaraki, a serial entrepreneur, venture capitalist, and very involved member of various technical associations and intergovernmental associations. He's well known for helping to found AI for Good, which is a large event and initiative within the United Nations under the ITU within the UN. And Stephen is one of the few people I've ever met in the intergovernmental world who sees a trajectory to posthuman intelligence and is considering where governance, soft, hard governance, technical standards, etc., might fit into bending that trajectory in a better direction. There's two parts of this interview I think are really interesting. Stephen's emphasis on technical associations like the Association for Computing Machinery and the IEEE and where they fit in, so not just hard governance, but that kind of soft governance, and also his ideas around a kind of natural alignment, even among the great powers like the US and China, towards a shared interest in aligning artificial intelligence. You may or may not agree with his perspectives, but I think they're worth chewing on, and I'm glad we got to speak with Stephen. Again, one of the few people in the IGO world that I think really gets it. So hope you enjoy this episode. This is Stephen Ibaraki here in The Trajectory. So Stephen, welcome to the program.
Hey, Dan, I'm thrilled to be here and jazzed. I'm excited about our upcoming conversation.
Absolutely. We're talking about, in my opinion, the fun stuff. And you've been thinking about some of these ideas for a little longer than most, and you've seen them applied in kind of the tech space, the governance space, etc. AGI governance, not an easy thing to nutshell, but we've got a little bit of time to unpack it. I'll start on kind of the timeline horizon. We've had the Bengios and Bostroms and, many great luminaries in the AI space speak a little bit about sort of how close they think we are to AI that's more generally capable than people in a more completely general way. From your vantage point, where do you suspect we are with regards to that, and why do you think so?
I would say from a AGI or artificial general intelligence, or something that sort of can mimic and do things that humans do, perhaps better. I would say we're about 6 years out, maybe 7 years. So within 10 years, I would say we're out. And in fact, I've written forwards of books indicating that we'll even have this by 2030. And I've explained what that experience would look like, right? Where you'd have some kind of assistant that's sort of integrated with you. You would treat that assistant as if it's human-like, but it's not. And let's not get confused, though. Let's not say that this is human intelligence. It's just a different kind of intelligence, right? It doesn't have to be human. Just like Corbin's a certain kind of bird type, has problem-solving capabilities, not human. Octopus have a distributed neural network system. It's not human, but yet problem solve. Some are even saying plants can problem solve. So doesn't have to be human. It's just different.
Yeah, I think some people, luckily our audience is probably not in the camp of like, well, that means it's just like people. I think they would understand it's sort of a submarine doesn't swim like a fish, Stephen, but it still gets the job done. There might be kinds of thinking that are not precisely the same as what we do, but still get the job done in terms of general capability. Would love to, you mentioned kind of writing forwards for books. I've seen some of your talks on these topics. You've talked about the fifth machine age and some other ideas, and we've got a little bit of time for it. In terms of what you would see AGI as, there's some folks who really are kind of a vision of, hey, this is sort of an eternal, assistant. And then there's other folks that really would see kind of a potential FOOM is often the term used of sort of AI that can build upon AI and potentially AI that can develop goals, that might be different than humans, which could be a good or a bad thing. And maybe even goals that are beyond our conception, just like our goals are beyond the conception of sea snails. When you think about AGI, is it more in kind of a tool camp, and would you always see it kind of staying there, or what's your vision of AGI when you think about this first level we're gonna get to here?
I see AGI as being a tool, but I actually see AGI in this kind of spectrum, right? So we have classical humans like you and I, Dan. Kind of
classical humans. That's awesome.
And then we have augmented humans. That means humans that have some kind of AI embedded in them. For example, I wear hearing aids, and my hearing aids have AI. And this AI is going to get so good that I would say in 2 to 3 years, I'll have better hearing than somebody who doesn't have hearing.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I call them augments or augmented human beings. And then we're going to have hybrid human beings, and they maybe have some genetic editing, which is already occurring. and they will have some kind of AI enhancement as well, and it maybe even have a synthetic arm or something that has AI embedded in it. And then together with hybrids, we'll have autonomous. And autonomous could be some kind of intelligence embodied into a robot, which would be your assistant at home or on the job. And you have a kind of autonomous capability in cars already. Like if you go to Phoenix, you actually have driverless cars, and they're all over the place. And in parts of China now, they have driverless taxis without safety drivers. So really, I see this world of transition, right? Classical, augmented, hybrids, autonomous.
Yeah. Okay, so the spectrum is fun, and we can play along this. There's a lot of folks that really can't think this far ahead. They can't even really think about augmentation. They don't see it as a spectrum from the hearing aid that you have to, posthuman sensory perception, maybe even senses that humans don't currently have today, but might be a lot of fun or might be very useful. These are all things that are potentially accessible. There's some folks who would think that, some of these autonomous intelligences that you articulate, should they be able to improve and leverage their autonomy to do more and more fast improving, or if augmented humans are now leveraging double the brain power here at some point to be able to work on these technology systems, that at some point these systems might develop agency, maybe to go off very autonomously and do things that humans want them to do, but maybe even just do things that seem, instrumentally useful to them, and maybe again stretch beyond sort of what we classical humans can conceive of in terms of goals. Do you see that as reasonable, or even for the the kind of automated crowd there? Do you see them mostly playing ball with humans into sort of an indefinite future, or do you see a forking happening there? Just want to get an idea of your future vision.
I see this as a transition. So, because we're so steeped in kind of the traditional classical human being, whether it's going back to hominids, over a million years ago to when we were sort of coexisting Neanderthal and
yes.
To modern Homo sapien, we're sort of very grounded in this old idea. But what will happen is, as we get enhanced, as we have implants, as we're augmented, and we get into hybrids, then increasingly our frame of mind of what it means to work with AI will change, right? And the expansion of our intellectual capability will give us a different mindset of what it means to be working with AI. And I believe that we'll be more accepting of AI having some kind of auto agency and having some kind of automatic development capability, because we'll be developing at the same time with this AI, because it will be embedded with the AI, right? So
yeah, and Kurzweil has this optimistic permutation of that. Kurzweil famously, a little bit strangely, really throwing on the rose-colored glasses from the get-go, kind of always has. Not that, I think all optimism is, good or bad, or all pessimism is good or bad, but I do think probably there's some kind of gray here. But this notion that, as we start to augment ourselves, there might eventually be some kind of either merger with AGI or a real ability to have kind of this cognitive freedom of what do we want our experience to be, whether it be gradients of bliss, whether it be new senses, new kind of bodies, and that the spectrum would be able to continue with great freedom. There's other perspectives that, hey, it's only been, less than 100 years that humans have, let's call it pseudo-reliably, not mostly been at war. It's only been a minute. It's been a real evolutionary millisecond that we've been able to have this sort of, peace period. I think it's a great thing. And there's some people that would say, man, if you start really throwing in divergent intelligences, brain augmentations that have humans with entirely new sets of goals and drives, right? You and I might be very different. Maybe we're on the opposite side of some countries that hate each other, but we both like eating food. We both want to go home to our families. We both like reading good books. But there will be intelligences that are almost like you take a Black Widow spider and scale it up. There's no monkey values going on there, right? There's no beauty in a sunset. These are not universal things to intelligence. They're particulars of our kind of intelligence. There's a supposition, and I'm not saying it's right, but that there will be some conflict to potentially manage as divergent intelligences that are pure AI, that are these hybrids, all start globbling together. Didn't work out super well for the Neanderthals, although I'm sure we interbred a little bit. What are your thoughts there about how that Cambrian explosion of intelligence upward, we'll be able to maintain some semblance of peace?
So everything is a probability, right? So it's a non-zero chance that we could end up like the Neanderthal, where there's some kind of future hybrid autonomous species of which we are part of what they are, but a minority part. And in essence, that becomes the next stage of evolution.
Yeah.
And it's machine driven, and it has unlimited capability, to what we think we have.
Comparatively, yes.
But really will have exponential kind of capabilities. That there's a non-zero chance that could happen. So it's real. There's the other chance that we will also just naturally evolve with this extended capability, and hopefully as we continue to evolve with its extended capability, we can keep it into sort of a safe, a positive, optimistic view of the universe, and sort of doing good and not so much doing bad and being warlike and so on.
Yeah.
Both are going to coexist, and that transition is going to determine what we're going through, which direction we're going in. And it may be that it's not a 1 and a 0 choice. It could be like a quantum spectrum.
Yeah.
You're going to have some entities that are going to go off the rails. You're going to have some that live in between, and you're going to have some that are really very positively driven, and all are going to coexist. The key is that at the end of this, that there's some glimpse of humanity that still survives, right?
Yeah. Although I think there are some people who would hope that we would have, a worthy successor bubble out of this, as hopefully we are worthy successors to the fish that had legs. I think we've done a good job. I think hopefully they would be happy with what we are. But yeah, to your point, your hope, and I think the hope of most humans, is that humans would have the freedom, even if it's not to maintain this exact same form, to still sort of be humans and exist in peace within these entities. But to your point, non-zero chance that might not happen. With that said, big panoply of possibilities, lots of probabilities of how it could shake out. You've been involved in many regards in kind of the ethics and standards ecosystem, but now increasingly the governance ecosystem with sort of the AI for good efforts, where a lot of these conversations are getting hashed out. How important do you see some kind of global coordination and or governance around AGI specifically, not just kind of AI for bias or AI for privacy, but this idea of kind of posthuman intelligence? How important is that for you, or in your opinion?
So again, you're going to have people who don't want that conversation. You're going to have people who really want that conversation to the nth degree, and almost like the European AI Act. And then you're going to have some kind of spectrum in between. And the reality is you're going to have all of those occurring at the same time. So you're going to have people who don't want any of this, who, on the dark web, let's say, and maybe in sort of rogue areas of the planet. And then you're going to have people who want it over, maybe a lot of regulation, a lot of governance and control over it. But it's going to be a spectrum. What it's going to happen, though, is probably a multi-stakeholder conversation, leveraging all of the great work that's been done by the science organizations like the Association for Computer Machinery, the IEEE, IFIP, and others, who have been working on codes and a code of ethics and principles of doing this right for decades, of which AGI and AI is a subset. And their work working in conjunction with the private sector, with CEOs and corporates, and the educational sector, media, and also within the UN system itself. So it's the ideal situation is a multi-stakeholder conversation, and looking at, can we put some kind of umbrella that's global, and to the best of our ability provide some universal AI governance guardrails, almost like an FDA of the world. You're not going to have a perfect situation. You're not going to be able to control it perfectly, because you've got open source and, again, rogue entities out there. But at least you've got some kind of a benchmark or standard that you can measure against. And AI for Good is trying to do that with their AI for Good global impact initiatives on the healthcare side. In other words, if you're going to produce an AI solution, why don't we measure it to make sure it adheres to some basic standards? These are the benchmark. The data adheres to some basic standards, and let's kind of agree that these are things that we feel AI should have before we will say, hey, we will trust it, right? So that is not a bad thing. That's a good thing to at least have some kind of standards in place that at least gives us a framework and a grounding and a basis to start, right?
I concur in many regards, and I'll just put a couple things on the table. You're sort of mentioning this idea of the global FDA. I think, and to your point, there will be folks that want nothing to do with this. We got, our dark web crowd, but even on this show, for example, we've had folks who really would see that any kind of international coordination or agreement around AGI would be, too much of a slippery slope towards authoritarianism or controlled by folks that don't understand the tech and would prevent its benefits. And really, they kind of want zero. And no joke, there's actually some people that I respect and like as people that have that opinion. There's others who are of the belief that, to be frank, and you're clearly somewhere in the middle, but I'm just drawing our goalposts here, or are the edges of our boundaries. There's others who are like, unless there's some degree of very firm, hate to say policing of sort of compute writ large in a much more tight global governance, not necessarily authoritarian per se, but like they would have to have some very significant powers across every corner of the world. Without that, we're likely to just end up with an arms race where this thing comes out of the box uncontrolled by people and harms us all and maybe ends life in general, and that would be a terrible outcome. So you have people on both ends. You're sort of more, a little bit into the coordination side of, hey, maybe there should be some overarching body that can ensure that some of these technologies beyond certain thresholds adhere to basic principles, and we can come to agreement on that and have multiple stakeholders on that. It sounds like that's the place on the spectrum where you sit. Let me know if I'm picking up what you're putting down, Stephen.
Yeah, I mean, I have the advantage that I work in the investment community, right? And I'm also work with sovereign fund investment communities. So government investment communities, private investment communities, UN-based investment communities. So I'm working investments across multi-stakeholder. I work in the science community and the engineering community, multi-stakeholder. I work across CEO communities. Both privately held, but also, enterprise multinationals and so on in the entrepreneurship space. So I work across all of the major entities, including media. And I would say overall, I hear an argument that let's have some kind of oversight. Let's have some kind of regulation, governance. Let's not make it too extreme, but let's not have it underpowered either, right? So
I'd sort of concur. I mean, our conversations are, CIO, Goldman Sachs, CTO, Takeda Pharmaceutical, all the way down to, the policy ecosystem. Not involved in investing myself, but business side, startup ecosystem, policy world. I see a good deal of interest in AI governance in a general sense. Privacy bias. Is it going to, is it only going to be Microsoft that's rich and, Africa's going to be poor? Maybe we want to control for that. I see those kind of social concerns around AI and economic and otherwise concerns around AI have within the halls of the OECD or within the conversations that I have if I'm at a UN event, whether it's, UNICRI or ICAO or whatever branch we're talking about. Some congenialness to sort of, hey, yeah, let's make sure it's not biased. Let's make sure it's not one or two companies or countries that actually gets rich when this stuff really expands if it becomes very powerful. I see not as much of that kind of support and continued conversation around the idea that this could be more powerful than people. Even within the OECD, they have an AI futures group. Francesca and Bengio and Stuart Russell and this whole crowd is sort of part of that, where, 2/3 of the room not really too much on the page of AGI. It's either not a concern, doesn't feel like it'll be relevant in their lifetimes or their children's lifetimes, so they disagree with you in that respect, or they just don't believe in it at all. Like it's all LLMs or hoopla. AI is never going to get there. It's literally a waste of time for us to think about. Do you see within those communities an interest in governance around AGI, or is it mostly around the more parochial AI concerns?
I see it around both the standard kind of AI and the natural development and evolution of AI, of which AGI is a portion of that spectrum.
I agree.
So,
yeah.
In a sense, the whole thing is being covered. And I think the reality is that if you were to pull, across the board, whether it's UN, CEOs, investors, scientists, experts, engineers, and big tech, they will say that AGI it's a non-zero. AGI is non-zero.
Absolutely.
It's going to
Absolutely. Oh, no, yeah.
I don't think it's 2100 either.
No. Well, and people used to think that, right? You look at Bostrom's polls from, 2014, 2015, when he did his first poll of all the AI academics. And it was like 2065 was ballpark average around then, and now it's like we're in a little bit of a different, place, but there's still a lot of folks for whom it is not even remotely a concern. They just think it's totally technically impossible. I happen to on some level disagree. But this idea of kind of beginning with a standard sort of body of some sort, this FDA globally, some people would say that would be leaning us too much towards authoritarianism. Some people would say maybe that's exactly the sweet spot for governance we need. It feels like for you, it's about the right sweet spot. What makes you feel like something more stringent around police and compute maybe would be too far? And what makes you feel like on the other side of kind of having none of that international FDA, just every country decides what they want to do with AI. Why is that inadequate? So maybe we could talk about those polls. Like, why don't you want something tighter? And then we could talk about why don't you want something a little looser?
If you get too tight, then you get a situation where people are afraid to innovate because they think they're going to get fined or they're going to expend a tremendous amount of energy and then find that all of that resource and energy they're not able to invoke a particular kind of solution because they're just the regulatory aspect is just too stringent. So you want to maintain some level of innovation. And in fact, if you have over-regulation, you're not going to be able to regulate the entire world. So if you have over-regulation, that could stifle a particular segment of society, and yet another one has no regulation, and they're going to continue to innovate. So you've got to have something that everybody can at least agree to, and that's the problem with over-regulation. The lack of any regulation, of course, I mean, I don't think anybody reasonably wants that, right? At least the people that I'm in contact with. Now, again, because people exist in a spectrum,
of course,
you're going to have the ones and the zeros, but the reality is we coexist in some kind of spectrum, right?
Totally. Most of my conversations sit somewhere in what I would call quite a reasonable middle, but I have had conversations on both camps. Interestingly enough, many more conversations on the no international coordination at all is better camp, which I don't agree with in totality, but I think it's, to your point, it's a multi-stakeholder conversation. I think those voices have to be in the room. When we talk about this kind of the FDA for AI, AGI idea, we're talking about general intelligence here, not just the parochial concerns. There's sort of, hey, we want systems that aren't, biased in some, racial or gender oriented way. Okay. We want, systems that aren't physically dangerous in these other ways. Okay. What would you see as kind of the core outcomes? If it was set up well, this initial level of coordination that you would see as the Goldilocks zone, what would it fundamentally achieve? It might be 50 things, but if we're going to boil it down to 2 or 3 that you would say, hey, that would be a great first job of AGI governance, what are those core things you'd hope to see it achieve?
To have some kind of way of benchmarking as these systems continue. So the great measurement tools, great ways of testing the capabilities, great ways of anticipating emerging capabilities. Right now, I don't think we have a great way of predicting these emerging capabilities. But putting more resources into looking where these things can predictably go, let's say in the next 2 to 3 years, and ensuring that it's not going to go into that dystopian side, like you said, where it runs away and invokes some kind of control where, it results in something that's very dire to a particular segment of the population or the whole population, right? And it's not just the population of us human beings, it's really the safety of the planet overall, right? So,
this great project of life. I think the big concerns that I think people bring up are certainly the extinction of humanity, but by golly, if we had kind of a totally unconscious machine system optimizing for something somewhat strange and arbitrary that, needed to use the Earth's atmosphere in order to achieve that goal and could somehow get its hands on a lot of physical instantiations and achieve that, we might just end up with, no more sentience, at least in this part of the universe, and that would be a bit of a shame. So certainly we want to steer clear from those things. So achieving kind of protection from that degree of safety, some degree of assurance on the other side. I'm with you there. What would that look like, and how might that initially operate for you? You mentioned kind of multi-stakeholder. I'm wondering what kind of agreements would have to be in place, and what kind of checks and balances and basic regulations would exist to kind of have this foundation layer of AGI governance come to being?
I would say, and those are very good questions. So why don't we then leverage the work for decades of the ACM and the IEEE and I-50 science organizations that have been looking at, the development of tech for good purposes, and then managing and controlling to ensure that the bad aspects don't happen. And they've got a lot of experience on that. They've got a lot of experience on establishing the principles and the frameworks, and then operationalizing. And what I mean by operationalizing is, what are the tools, the benchmarks, the techniques we can use to ensure that we're on mark, we don't go off the rails, right? So leverage that work and making sure that we continue that work on the operational side, so we can actually track the progress, see where there could be a problematic situation, and then curbing those problematic situations in a thoughtful way, and providing the tools so that could happen, and the oversight so that can happen. So I would put more emphasis on these science organizations who've been doing this for decades, and just giving them, or working with them with more resources, right?
Well, I'd love to poke a little bit into that. And you've been involved in these organizations for many, many decades, and so probably have some more references. I've only been around for the last 10 years in this space with, the IEEE as their ethically aligned design. And we've had Konstantinos and John Havens and some of the folks from those efforts on the program over the years. But clearly their efforts around standardization and kind of ethics and thinking about outcomes is an older legacy, both in the IEEE, the ACM, maybe even some other organizations. What are maybe some of the key papers, principles, maybe starting points for the listeners that are tuned in to say, oh, maybe I want to look at some of the older stuff. Maybe there's some grounding elements there that we don't want to reinvent the wheel on. What are some good places to go to understand that?
If you just do a generalized search under IEEE, ACM, Code of Ethics, and from there you can mine into AI, and which is really, in my mind, a subset of the broader principles of ethical conduct, ethical operationalization of these materials. KIPS would be another one out of Canada. We've been working on this area for a long time. IFIP, for example, has adopted a code of ethics for the development of AI, but also any kind of tech. So really, it's not so much remembering the theme, it's remembering the organization. So ACM, we're the world's largest computing science organization. AI is a subset of what we do, right?
Yep. Or Turing Award, all that.
Yeah, and then now, we do clearly work with AAAI, the Artificial Intelligence Organization.
Yep.
But we were first, right? We were out there earlier, and the AI organization formed much later, right? So
certainly.
Same thing with IEEE. I mean, those are the foremost organizations, and just staying in contact with them. And then you can do keyword searches on anything of your interest. Another area which is related to this is UNESCO and their programs for the ethical use of AI. They've come out with recommendations. They're trying to operationalize that as well globally. They're working with ITU. ITU is a standards organization, right? Nearly 160 years old. So this is in their framework of, can we get to some kind of global agreement? So ITU working with these scientific organizations, working with UNESCO. In fact, there is a joint effort between ITU and UNESCO, and what they've done is they've surveyed all of the available kind of AI work, and they've tried to put it all together. And they're also working together on the governance side in some way, right? So
really healthy handful of organizations for people to look up. But to your point, some of these considerations around technology's impact, ensuring that, thinking about it from a standards or a code of ethics domain, probably shouldn't be reinvented. I mean, I'm aware of, the IEEE's newer efforts of, again, ethically aligned design and other efforts like that. The OECD, of course, has the OECD AI principles, and they're trying to make those a little bit more applicable. But I think the credence to your point is, hey, there might be some of these things that we have in common that we want to embed in our tech that we've already sort of thought of. And instead of sort of starting at the level of the clouds, we might be able to build up from some of that foundation in an important way. I guess turning that into the brass tacks, impact, I could think about many potential examples of what that would look like. And I'll just lay them out here. I'm not advocating for anything right now. I'm just putting ideas on the table for you to batter around a little bit. I could see, some sort of set of rules or code of ethics around, the prevention of physical harms, and maybe any kind of robotic instantiation that's controlling anything in the physical world. Maybe we'd want to have some sort of, okay, if it's this level of risk, like it's a full-blown automotive vehicle that people are riding in, we need to be able to test it in these 3 or 4 ways. If it's this kind of industrial equipment, here's kind of a benchmark for that. If it's this other thing, here's kind of a benchmark. So maybe there would be something like that. There might be, race and bias kinds of things that come up, and we might say, okay, well, if it has to do with these kinds of high-touch consumer data applications, here's a couple basic tests we'd want it to pass. But again, this isn't quite getting us to the AGI side of things. This is more on the parochial side. I think some of the concerns we've seen around AGI are, what can we do to kind of make sure that no individual party, whether it's in China or the US, if we're just talking about, some of the bigger guys here, are blasting off in a direction of capability and a direction of kind of unknown, maybe uncontrolled capability that could lead to the kind of negative outcome you had. So we've got our parochial concerns, but we also have this sort of keeping a little bit of tabs here, that if we say, here's where we're going, here's where we're going to experiment and kind of gradually move forward as a species, that no one's just taken off like a rocket to build something that might bring about these gigantically bad outcomes. Which of this panoply of things would you want this org to do? And maybe a little bit of how would you want it to go about that to sort of maintain that transparency and steering of these factors?
So you have these existing organizations. So what you do is you just make sure that there's specific targets on the AGI side in terms of outcomes, where it could possibly go. And then what are the frameworks and the principles that underline that, the tools and processes to ensure that we can stay safe. So leverage the existing work, add more resources to the teams that are working on the AGI side and the futuristic kind of outcomes and probabilities, but operationalizing it. In other words, here are tools and ways to manage and look for and monitor and bring some transparency to these opaque models, so you have a better idea where there's going. And there's a lot of work, like Fraunhofer, for example, has these heat maps, technologies that they developed on the LLM side, so you can have a better idea what's happening. So once you've got some kind of organizational structure, it's proliferating, everybody's agreeing to it, everybody's speaking sort of the same language within the UN, within corporates, also within these science organizations, then you can start populating and bringing resources. So there's an entity, as I mentioned, Fraunhofer is working on this. There's different universities, Stanford and others are working on these kind of problems, right? And then bring those resources to bear and put them on the table. The issue right now in the world is so much is siloed. You got different people sort of working. And that's where the coordination is required. I mean, you're going to be a big part of this, right? Because you're putting out the message of saying, here's this entity working on a particular aspect. Why don't you put it together, right? So why don't you harmonize this? And by the way, the UNESCO is trying to do that. They're trying to bring all the principles and parties together to try to harmonize.
So UNESCO has some existing efforts around
harmonizing.
Okay, interesting. I'll have to look up if that has a particular name. I haven't seen a lot from UNESCO around, I guess, the general intelligence side of things, but it sounds like, at least just in terms of AI at a high level, they're aiming to pull this under a roof somewhere.
Yeah, I would say UNESCO and ITU are trying to bring these kind of collective capabilities between the two organizations together. In the healthcare area, there's a new initiative that's been launched, and it's a partnership between the World Health Organization, because of the health side and the implications of AI and potentially AGI in healthcare, together with the ITU, which is also looking at AGI, but also where AI is progressing. You saw some of that at the AI for Good Summit, right?
Yep.
Set topics together with very practical topics. So you've got the World Health Organization, the ITU, and the World IP Organization, which is on the innovation intellectual property side, which is more, what is new tech, what is new capabilities that are coming about, what are the intellectual property considerations of that? And then these three forces working together in harmony to address the bigger issue of AI and healthcare, and then also the future implications of where AI is going into healthcare. And then how do you do that? Well, you do that by saying, hey, we're an open platform. We're building benchmarks that you can measure against. They got open teams, working groups that can work on different aspects of this. Startups and innovation is part of that program as well, so that they can see what's upcoming and making sure that that community is embraced into this collective effort. But corporates are working on this. Yeah, I mean, there's corporate entities that have come together to say, how can we do this in a controlled and managed way and ensure that we can start detecting whether there's going to be issues that are upcoming, and we can ameliorate or put safeguards on this. I would say of all the corpus that I see out there, probably the most mature would be Microsoft, only because they've been around for so long, and they're not dependent on search or one particular marketplace. They're basically so diverse in terms of all of the
product suite
they've made, right? So they provide a lot of free material on responsible AI. They have innovation programs for youth and responsible AI, which a youth can embrace. Excuse me. They have co-pilots, even in things like quantum computing, because quantum computing is an area that's going to accelerate all of this development. And of course, huge interest in the intersection of quantum and AI, and what could that possibly mean. And in fact, they produced quantum co-pilots, so that, let's say you're a student, let's say you're a grade 11 student somewhere in the world, and you're really interested in accessing this. Well, they have co-pilots that allow you to program, and it'll guide you through writing your own your first quantum program. But that doesn't have to be quantum; it could be AI. Yeah. Program, right? So. And because AGI is in the nearer term, people are afraid of that term in a way. But
they are.
Right? Because they don't want to turn people off, right?
Oh, yeah. They're like, oh, it has religious connotations, and oh, it's impossible. And so some people believe it's possible, but they don't want to say it because people are going to look at them like they believe in aliens. And then other people, want to shy away from it because they just think, oh, it's bunk. And, Jeff Hinton has lost his mind. He's not a serious person anymore. There's a lot of different opinions out there.
Yeah, so Dan, that's why I'm saying that even though it may not seem like AGI is not being addressed, it's such a controversial term. In the background, the future of the development of these different AI models is being addressed, and where it's going to go.
That's
even
true.
Though they may avoid the word AGI.
Yeah. It's still influencing the trajectory, to your point here. And you brought up another really good point. I mean, indeed, the purpose of the conversations here and the trajectory is around where are we taking ourselves and what's going to be the best way to go about doing that. I think that has to be a multi-stakeholder thing. Communication will be part of it, but there's so much more than just getting the word out, of course. You had brought up some of the great organizations that, have moved forward in principles and codes of ethics and maybe efforts around these things, but how siloed it is. I think that is indeed some of the concern here, is that things do feel kind of siloed now. And I think there's a lot of folks that are real skeptics that, okay, if let's say it's the UN hypothetically, if the UN has some sort of a body around a basic kind of coordination and governance about AI systems above power level X, whatever the case may be, that if the US starts really playing ball, will China? Or if China starts playing ball, will the United States? I think that there's an arms race somewhat overtly between the private sector organizations. Meta, DeepMind, OpenAI are all pretty overt, like we're aiming to build posthuman intelligence. And they know that if they don't do it, their competitors will. Some people have argued that could be dangerous, assuming AGI could do the things we suspect it could. Same thing internationally. And this is why some folks think it would be bunk or it would be impossible or a waste of time to set up this coordination. What would be your response to that? Or maybe your hope for how such coordination could have, and maybe this is too aggressive of a term, but could have enough teeth to make sure we are gauging the frontier gigantic leap efforts of big nations like the US and China, who probably do see each other as rivals now. What could be done to still make this kind of coordination relevant given those power dynamics?
There are power dynamics and there's competition, but overall, there is an interest in all the major countries who are dominant in this area to want to, at some level, cooperate and to have some level of common understanding. I don't hear counter to that.
Yeah, I think that's true on some level, yeah.
And the same is true of corporates. Even though they compete, at some level, they want some cooperation, particularly on the policy governance. How do we ensure that we maintain some level of control over this as it's escalating and accelerating? So that will self-organize and into itself, but there are governmental efforts anyways, which will require people to come to the table, right? It's just like the European Act. If you want to do something in Europe, you have to play. Now, some corporates may not want to play in that marketplace because they think the risk is too high. But what will happen is that will then maybe cause some changes and transitions. People will learn from that experience, what's happened in Europe. If some people don't want to play in that marketplace, and they'll maybe produce something that's a little bit more middle ground, and you're seeing that happen in different parts of the world, right? Like in the U.S. and Canada and so on, and even the European effort. Maybe they will look at who's willing to get into their market, who has some opposition to how they're structured, and maybe they'll make some amendments as well. I mean, everybody's learning in real time, and I think those adjustments overall will harmonize, and overall those adjustments will lead to something that everybody agrees to.
Well, I some people would call that a rather optimistic take on the future. I don't think it's a totally non-zero chance that could bubble about. I do recall some people being rather excited that at that first AI Safety Summit, which I know now its name has changed away from safety because different countries have different views on AGI. Countries that eat croissants maybe don't care about it as much. But either way, at that first summit, there was some sort of optimism around, hey, at least China gave some lip service to, or I don't know, sign some basic words about sort of some degree of cooperation around sort of the runaway capability of AI, which is just a tip of the hat. I don't think we should really see that as some kind of assurance of global coordination. But if the hats keep tipping, and if they keep tipping across organizations, and if citizenry themselves start worrying about arms races and things like that, it sounds like for you, the emergent coordination between the groups and then between the nations and these bigger, broader international conversations, you're optimistic it could congeal into something where we feel good enough about the checks and balances to not be in this tension arms race scenario anymore.
Yeah, the key is not to get so caught up in the daily volatility and to start averaging out over a period of time. So in general, if you average out over a period of time, the trend is in the positive direction, right? The trend is towards some level of governance. The trend is towards some establishment of policies, and that's already happening at the country level.
Yep.
But keep in mind that when a country comes out with a particular framework or model, policy, or regulatory aspect, they're not doing it in isolation. They're looking at what other countries are doing.
Yeah.
So there's already kind of an implicit equalization that's occurring without it being explicit. And if you were to examine all of the existing programs that are already out there, you'll see many common elements, right? And those those common elements are a foundation for everybody to agree to, right? So
we've given the listeners a little bit of kind of homework and some organizations to look at, kind of a vision of what the Goldilocks zone for AGI governance might be. And you've also been pretty frank about this cyborg human AGI sort of future, which I am very congenial with and think is something that honestly we should be contesting with even more in the intergovernmental world. I don't see those conversations happening enough right now. I'm very much on your side in that regard. In closing here, as you think about some of the initial things that you hope will start to happen that could start to roll the snowball in this direction. You've kind of mentioned, countries make their governance and then they kind of share that. And there's some emergent ideas about the principles we want to stay attuned to. So hopefully some of this stuff will bloom unto itself. But if you think about early moves that maybe the UN could make, or maybe one of the great powers could make, or one of the AGI labs could make that would sort of inch us towards that Goldilocks zone of governance, what would be some of those things you'd be hoping for? Those early first steps that would be a sign of progress for you?
Probably the corporates in a more demonstrated programmatic way coming out with messaging as a community. And this could be through the World Innovation Technology Systems Alliance called WITSA.
WITSA.
So back in 1978, a consortium of an alliance formed of all of the industry associations around the world. So keep in mind, 50 years ago or 40 years ago, you have all of these tech companies, right? And these tech companies realize that they're competing, but they also have common interests. So they form associations within their individual countries. So, for example, in India, it's NASSCOM. NASSCOM
okay, I've heard of NASSCOM, yeah.
Yeah, and in the U.S., you got CTA, which runs CES conference. And so each country has done this, right? As tech industries say, you know what, we compete, but we have common interests. And then back in 78, all of these individual country organizations realized we have global interests in common. So why don't we form a global industry association? And it's called WITSA, the World Innovation Technology Systems Alliance. And they're actually setting up multiple centers of excellence around the world to bring kind of a unification of this sort of thinking around AI and doing it safely and making sure you're working with governments.
So you think the private sector really could be the crucial catalyst to maybe starting this international, because Microsoft, of course, operates in all these countries. So you see that as actually an important spearhead here.
Yeah, in fact, they're already working on this with AI centers of excellence, and they represent over 90% of all tech industry globally as an industry alliance, right? So that's called WITSA. But there's other examples within different sectors. All of them have AI on their agenda,
radar, and
how to manage it, but not just how to integrate it, but how to manage it safely and so on, right? So, because nobody wants to take a reputation hit if you use AI and it doesn't work, right? So.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yes, I think maybe it's a good closing note. We compete, but we have common interests. I would say it's true for big tech. It's pretty darn true for humanity writ large in general. And maybe to your point, these kind of faster moving technology companies could start some of that international, becoming intergovernmental conversation, maybe even a little bit faster than the pure policy ecosystem. So I've certainly got my fingers crossed that you are right there. And I think these are an important set of ingredients to getting us there. And I know that's all we have for time, but Stephen, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, it was a real pleasure. I was thrilled to be here with you today, Dan, and very thoughtful questions. I just love the way you managed the whole conversation. And, and we got some important points and resources that maybe the audience wasn't aware that existed, right?
Exactly. Giving people homework is part of what I do. And Stephen, you kind of did the work for me today. So I appreciate that very much. Again, thanks so much for being here. So that's all for this episode of The Trajectory. I think there's a few things to chew on from Stephen's episode that I think are worth considering, and I'll probably be doing more thinking on myself. The first is, again, this idea of soft governance and where some of these organizations that have worked on the early proxies of sort of ethics and governance within technology sort of fit in. Again, IEEE standards, ACM. People often think, okay, to control AGI would imply, men with machine guns next to every data center. But I think there really is a much more rich tapestry of ways to align and incent shared interests around maybe steering clear of some of the more overt dangers of artificial general intelligence. And Stephen opened some of that up. His ideas around the alignment of the U.S. and China. I think most of the talk we see now, even among the big AGI leaders, Dario, Altman, many others have kind of sprinkled in this idea of kind of staying ahead of the authoritarian adversary here in terms of China. It'll be interesting to see if some of these forces of alignment, such as sort of this shared interest in where the heck is this going, what is this turning into, also manifests on the table and maybe can counterbalance some of the natural arms race dynamics we're seeing now. Again, Stephen's one of the very few people in the intergovernmental world I've ever spoken to that cares about these things. Most of the time, if I'm in the UN, the OECD, etc., really well-intended folks, often a lot of good discussions, not so many of them around posthuman intelligence. Stephen gets it. He's had Sam Altman, Jeff Hinton, a lot of great speakers at AI for Good talk about the bigger picture issues, and it's really cool to see folks in the policy space who can get to this level and really talk about transhumanism and other things like that. So hopefully you enjoyed this one. Stay tuned for our 4th episode of AGI Governance next up on The Trajectory.